Whispers before the storm, the world before the plague. Close your eyes. Drift back, not just a few years or decades, but centuries. The year is 1346. The wind is cold over Europe. The night is quiet. Villages glow with lanterns. Horses tread the dirt roads. Bells chime from stone churches. In the silence of this world, something invisible has begun to stir, something that will leave no life untouched. Tonight, we begin the story of the Black Death, not with the horror, but with the world that came before it. Europe before the plague was growing fast. In the early 1300s, Europe's population was booming. There were more people than ever before, reaching perhaps 80 million. Cities were expanding. Trade routes were active. Life felt busy, crowded, almost modern. Yet this growth was also fragile. One poor harvest, one long winter, and famine spread quickly. People lived close together. Streets were narrow, water was unclean, disease needed only a spark. There was no knowledge of germs. Doctors of the 14th century believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness came, they thought, from imbalances in these, or from miasma, a bad air. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand contagion. So when the plague came, they were blind to its cause. Imagine fighting a monster with no name, no face, no rules. The Silk Road linked worlds and disease. Trade routes from China to Europe, known as the Silk Road, carried silk, spices, metals, and rats. Fleas hitchhiked in grain sacks. Bacteria rode from Asia to the Black Sea. War, famine, and population shifts stirred the pot. The world was more connected than ever, and more vulnerable than ever. A single flea in China could bring death to Italy, and it would. The Mongol Empire unintentionally paved the way. The Mongol Empire had unified a vast part of Asia under a single system, opening borders and creating stability. But this also made it easy for the plague to travel. As the empire declined in the 1330s, political chaos and war pushed people and diseases westward. Even empires cannot escape nature's rules. A new kind of warfare began in Crimea. At the Black Sea port of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces laid siege to a Genoese trade colony. During the attack, plague broke out in the Mongol camp. According to legend, they catapulted the infected dead into the city. One of the earliest known examples of biological warfare, traders who escaped by ship took more than cargo home. They brought death in their holds, death in the air, death in their breath. Rats and fleas were the true carriers. The bacterium Yersinia pestis lived inside fleas, lived on black rats. Rats lived on ships and cities and homes. When infected fleas bit humans, the disease transferred. It was not the air itself. It was the silent, crawling things we didn't see. And by the time people noticed, it was too late. The first signs appeared in the east. Long before it reached Europe, the plague spread in waves across China, India, and the Middle East. Chinese records speak of mysterious diseases decimating cities. In 1331, one outbreak killed millions in China. This was not a European story alone. It was global, a single thread pulled tight across continents. Ports were the front line. As Genoese ships fled the Black Sea, they stopped in Constantinople, Messina, and Marseille. At each port, dockworkers fell ill. Priests died. Sailors vanished. Then the cities behind them darkened. The plague didn't march, it leapt, like sparks across a field of dry grass. People believed the end was near. When the plague first appeared, people turned to God, to superstition, to fear. Many believed it was divine punishment. Others blamed minorities, outsiders, the stars. The medical community was helpless. The population whispered of omens, of foul smells, of black boils and sudden death, and fear became its own infection. But before the horror, there was hope. In 1346, a peasant might still sing by the fire. A merchant might count his coins, dreaming of spring. A child might chase a wooden hoop through the street. No one knew that life as they understood it was about to change forever, and history was about to hold its breath. The plague arrives how the Black Death spread across Europe. The year is 1347. The breeze carries salt from the sea. Sailors return home with stories, crates, and weary eyes. But this time, something else steps off the ship, something too small to see, too quiet to hear, and too deadly to stop. This is when the Black Death truly began its journey through Europe. It began in Messina, Sicily. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships arrived in Messina's harbor. Many aboard were already dead. The rest were dying, fevered, bleeding, covered in swellings. Authorities tried to drive them away, but it was too late. The rats stayed, the fleas spread, and death began to walk inland. One city, one moment, the world tilted. Symptoms came swiftly. The most common form of plague was bubonic, named for the painful swellings, buboes that grew in the groin, neck, and armpits. Victims experienced sudden fever, vomiting, fatigue, and blackened skin. Death came within days, sometimes within hours. It didn't knock. It opened the door and stepped inside. Other forms were even deadlier. The pneumonic plague attacked the lungs. It spread through the air, through coughs, breath, even conversation. And the septicemic plague infected the blood, killing almost instantly. No warning, no cure, just collapse. No scream was fast enough to outrun it. Cities were hit hardest. In dense towns like Florence, Paris, and London, people lived side by side. Water was shared. Streets were narrow. Livestock and humans mingled. Within weeks of its arrival, entire neighborhoods emptied. Homes stood silent, chimneys cold, doors open. The markets no longer rang with haggling, only echoes remained. People fled, but brought it with them. As panic spread, so did the people. Nobles retreated to country estates. Peasants fled to hills, but wherever they ran, they took the plague with them. Villages that had never seen a ship began to see coffins. Safety was a memory, not a destination. The death rate was unimaginable. Modern estimates suggest that between 30% to 60% of Europe's population died within just a few years. In some towns, everyone vanished. In others, only a handful survived. Fields grew wild. Churches stood empty. The living buried the dead until they too were buried. No war had ever done this. No storm, no famine. No one was spared. Kings, bishops, bakers, farmers, the plague cared for no title. Queen Joan of England died on her way to marry a Castilian prince. Entire monasteries vanished. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs, hoping the scent would keep the plague away. But no costume could hide from fate. Parents abandoned children, not from cruelty, from terror. Many feared even touching the sick would bring death. Children were left to cry alone. Husbands left wives. Friends turned from each other. Priests stopped entering homes. Gravediggers wore no robes, only desperation. It was a time when compassion bent under the weight of survival. Art and culture turned somber. The dance macabre, or a dance of death, became a common theme in paintings and poetry. Skeletons danced with the living, reminding all that death spared no one. Bells rang not for weddings, but for funerals. Every chapel echoed with unanswered prayers. The world's palette darkened in color and in soul. People searched for meaning. Was this punishment from God? A test? An end? Some turned to extreme piety. Flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves to atone for sin. Others gave in to despair, losing themselves in indulgence or violence. Jews were falsely blamed and massacred across Europe. A tragedy layered on top of a tragedy. Fear does not always bring wisdom. The dead overwhelmed the living. There weren't enough hands to bury the fallen. Mass graves became common. In some cities, carts roamed the streets calling, "Bring out your dead." The sound of wheels on stone meant another body, another goodbye, and the silence afterward meant another empty home. But through it all, some endured. Not everyone perished. Some were immune. Others survived and rebuilt. Amid the morning, candles still flickered. Bread still baked. Laughter, cautious, thin, still echoed in some corners. The plague was cruel, but not final, because even in the darkest night, someone always lives to see dawn. Responses to the unknown: how humanity faced the plague. Imagine a world where every answer fails, where the doctors don't know what to do, where the priests fall ill, where kings lock their gates and the poor wait in line for bread and burial. This is how humanity responded: clarity, but with chaos, prayer, and the soft tremble of fear. Medical knowledge collapsed. Physicians of the 14th century had no understanding of infection. They tried bleeding, purging, herbs, astrology, and prayers. Many believed that aligning planets, especially Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, had poisoned the air. Others blamed bad smells or imbalance in the body's fluids, but none of their treatments worked. The death toll rose. and trust in medicine fell. The plague doctors became a symbol. To protect themselves, some physicians wore long robes, gloves, and beaked masks filled with fragrant herbs or vinegar-soaked sponges. The beak was thought to filter out the disease. Their appearance was eerie, more like a spirit than a healer. And while their remedies often failed, their presence became iconic, the shape of fear dressed like hope. Religion played a central role. Many believed the plague was punishment for sin. Churches were packed with those seeking forgiveness. Priests led processions. People lit candles by the thousands. But when priests died and prayers went unanswered, faith was shaken. Some clung tighter to God. Others walked away forever. The silence of the altar became louder than any sermon. Flagellants filled the streets. In parts of Europe, groups of men and women marched barefoot through towns, whipping themselves in public as penance. They believed self-punishment could lift the curse. Crowds followed them. Songs were sung, blood stained the stones. And in their pain they found purpose. For some, pain felt safer than confusion. Jews were scapegoated again and again. Rumors spread that Jewish communities had poisoned wells. Fueled by fear and ignorance, massacres followed. Entire towns were burned. Thousands were killed. In Strasbourg, hundreds of Jews were executed in 1349 despite having already suffered the plague themselves. The plague killed with infection, but hatred killed with fire. Governments were helpless. Kings, lords, and councils issued orders. Quarantine ports cleaned the streets, burned contaminated belongings. But the spread was too fast. The mechanisms of power were too slow. In many places, governments simply broke down. Justice, health, and order vanished. And in the vacuum, people had to rule themselves. Quarantine was invented. In places like Venice and Dubrovnik, ships were ordered to wait 40 days before passengers could disembark. This was known as 40 giorni, the root of our modern word quarantine. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. A slow beginning to the idea that isolation could save lives. Immersive fronts depicted skeletons and graves, not angels or saints. Death was no longer hidden. It stood front and center. Music slowed. Statues wept. Manuscripts were filled with black ink and red warnings. Even lullabies whispered of loss. The culture reflected what the people couldn't say aloud. Burial became mechanical. With so many dead, rituals became rushed. Priests read final prayers from a distance. Bodies were buried in stacks. Graves were dug quickly. Names were forgotten. Funerals became tasks, not tributes. But even hurried burials were a kind of love, a last human gesture in an inhuman time. Some turned to hedonism. If tomorrow was uncertain, some chose to live fully today. Feasting, drinking, gambling, and song flourished in certain quarters. The idea was simple. Enjoy the moment because it may be your last. Not everyone found comfort in silence. Some found it in sound. Families broke apart. To avoid infection, many families separated. Some parents abandoned sick children. Others sealed themselves inside homes. Doors were nailed shut. Meals were passed through windows. Trust dissolved. In a world where touch could kill, love had to take new form. Yet some responded with kindness. There were those who stayed, who tended to the sick, who buried the dead, who shared their food. Some monks chose to live among the infected, knowing it meant death. Some midwives continued to deliver babies. Some strangers held hands with the dying. In the middle of fear, kindness still flickered, so the world spun on slower, sadder, quieter. Responses varied, but everywhere, in every city, every village, every heart, there was one common sound, the soft unspoken question, why? A new world emerges life during the plague. Imagine waking up and everything is changed. Your street is quieter. Your neighbor's windows stay shuttered. The market is closed. The church bells ring too often. People walk farther apart, and the person you once were no longer fits this world. This was life in the time of plague, not just fear and death, but constant, subtle change. Villages emptied. Fields grew wild. When entire families died, their land was left untended. Crops withered. Wheat turned to weeds. In some regions, forests began reclaiming farmland. Paths disappeared beneath moss. Fences fell. The earth paused, not because it chose to, but because the hands that worked it were gone. Laborers became rare and powerful. With fewer workers, demand for labor rose sharply. Survivors could demand better wages. Some peasants left the land to work in towns. For the first time in generations, the poor had leverage. The rigid social pyramid began to crack. Silently, history's tide began to shift. Governments tried to stop change. In England, the Statute of Laborers 1351 was passed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Authorities feared losing control. They couldn't stop the deaths, but they tried to stop the ripple effects. Still, people found ways around the rules. The world was changing faster than law could follow. A rising tide doesn't ask permission. Entire professions vanished. In some cities, every member of a guild or trade died. No bakers, no blacksmiths, no teachers. Children grew up with skills unpassed. Apprenticeship lines were broken. In other places, new trades bloomed. Grave diggers, coffin makers, plague cart drivers. Where death goes, new kinds of work emerged. Clothing and fashion changed. With trade disrupted, access to fine cloth and dyes fell. People wore simpler garments. Mourning colors, blacks, grays, browns, became more common. And as wealth shifted, former peasants began dressing in ways once reserved for the upper class. The threads of society were being rewoven. Cities changed their shape. In response to the plague, some cities widened streets. Others cleaned wells and introduced rudimentary sanitation. Quarantine houses were built. Pest houses stood outside city walls. Over time, urban planning slowly evolved. From tragedy came the first thoughts of public health. Marriage patterns shifted. With so many deaths, marriage rates dipped and then surged. Widows and widowers remarried quickly. People wed younger. Dowries changed. And suddenly, matches were about survival, not status. New families formed fast, trying to rebuild something broken. Love in the time of plague was urgent and often brief. Families grew strange shapes. Many children lost both parents. Siblings were separated. Orphans became common. Households mixed. A grandmother, a distant cousin, a neighbor's child. Families didn't always match in blood anymore. They matched in need. Love was measured by presence, not relation. Fear lingered in the streets. Even between waves of the plague, fear remained. People flinched at coughs, avoided strangers, avoided each other. Small kindnesses, a loaf left at a doorstep, away from a window, became large acts. Every breath was measured, every smile earned. Festivals grew quieter, then louder. In the immediate years, celebrations ceased. No music, no parades, no laughter in the squares. But after the worst passed, some towns erupted in joy. Carnivals returned. Songs filled the streets. People danced not in denial, but in gratitude. The silence cracked open and color spilled out. Literature began to reflect survival. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio penned the Decameron, tales told by plague survivors. These weren't just stories of loss, but of humor, love, and strange joy. The tone of literature changed. Less about saints, more about people. Flawed, funny, fragile people. The human voice returned in ink and paper. People never looked at life the same way again. The plague had touched everything. It left no one unchanged. People valued food more, time more, song more. Every sunrise felt different. Every good day, a gift. For some, faith deepened. For others, doubt grew. But all agreed on one thing. Life was not to be wasted. Aftermath and awakening had changed Europe. The bells grew quiet. The graves stopped opening. The air still carried whispers, but fewer cries. Europe, in the wake of its greatest horror, began to look around, at its empty fields, its altered cities, and its surviving hearts. And then it began to think. The plague didn't end all at once. It came in waves, over and over. For years, the most devastating waves struck between 1347 and 1351. But smaller outbreaks returned again and again. Every decade or so for centuries, people learned to live in the shadow of recurrence. It never quite left, but it faded into background silence. The population had changed forever. Europe lost tens of millions. Some regions lost 70% of their people. The demographic balance was altered. Fewer children, fewer elders, more survivors hardened by loss. Fields were abandoned. Churches had no choirs. Entire surnames vanished. A continent had exhaled, and not everyone breathed in again. Land was suddenly plentiful. With so many dead, there was more land available than people to work it. Surviving peasants sometimes found themselves in possession of plots, homes, and opportunities they would have never had before. For the first time in memory, landowners had to ask for labor. Power had begun to shift. Serfdom began to crumble. Tied to the land, serfs had few rights. But after the plague, many demanded freedom in exchange for work. Some left estates entirely. Others became tenant farmers or tradesmen. Over the next century, the old feudal structures began to weaken. The plague hadn't just taken lives, it had broken chains. Women gained new roles. With so many men gone, women stepped into new positions, managing businesses, running farms, healing, leading households. While rights didn't expand legally overnight, expectations quietly shifted. The boundaries of a woman's work blurred. Necessity, it turns out, has no patience for tradition. The church lost some of its power. So many priests died that replacements were rushed and untrained. Faithful believers had seen prayers go unanswered. Some grew disillusioned. Others turned inward. Monasteries closed. Tithes declined. And a quiet skepticism grew beneath the pews. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, just distance. New religious movements emerged. Mysticism flourished. People seeking personal connections with the divine rather than relying on clergy. Lay movements spread. Some focused on poverty, simplicity, inner reflection. Others preached apocalyptic visions. Spiritual hunger deepened. The soul still reached out, but in new directions. Education paused, then grew. Universities closed during the plague and many scholars were lost. But when they reopened, they had new questions. Why had this happened? Could it happen again? And what could be learned to prevent it? Curiosity replaced helplessness. Art became more human. Post-plague art reflected suffering, yes, but also intimacy. More portraits, more individual stories. Death remained a theme, but so did love, laughter, daily life. The sacred became personal. The holy began to look like us. Artists painted not just saints, but survivors. Architecture told a new story. Grander cathedrals gave way to simpler chapels. Plague columns were erected in public squares, monuments of both gratitude and mourning. Some towns redesigned streets, opened squares, and built hospitals with wider windows and fresh air. The future began to rise from the ruins. The economy slowly recovered. Inflation came first, prices rose with scarcity, but eventually markets rebounded. Trade picked up, guilds formed anew, craftsmen were valued. In time, merchants grew rich, and with them, cities began to thrive again. Gold does not rust, but it does wait. A seed was planted, the beginning of change. The Renaissance would not come for decades, but its roots were sown in the ashes of the plague. People began to question, to observe, to document, to hope. The world had shrunk, but thought had expanded. From sorrow came spark. So the world didn't snap back into place. It grew differently, bent, softened. The Black Death had stolen years, names, and futures, but it had also carved out space, and in that hollow, something new began to bloom. Echoes through time how the plague changed the world forever. The ships had long since docked. The mass graves had settled. The candles had burned down. And yet the Black Death never truly left. Like a shadow cast by a setting sun, its reach stretched far beyond the moment it happened. Tonight, we walk softly through the echoes. The idea of public health was born. Before the plague, illness was considered personal, a punishment, a fate, a test of faith. But after, cities began to organize health boards. Inspectors were hired, waste was cleared, rules for quarantine emerged. Venice created the world's first official lazaretto, an isolated hospital island for the sick. Disease had become a public problem, and so for the first time, cities began to prepare. The word quarantine entered global language. From the Venetian 40 giorni, of 40 days, the idea of enforced isolation became law. Ships, travelers, even entire towns were made to wait. The practice spread to other nations, and centuries later it remains one of our most effective tools. Isolation, once feared, became protection. Medicine became more empirical. Old models, humors, astrology, superstition, had failed. Slowly, medicine began to move toward observation. Dissection became more accepted. Doctors recorded symptoms. Diagnoses shifted from celestial to physical. Universities reformed their teachings. Healing at last began to look inward. Hospitals were reimagined. Before the plague, hospitals were places of prayer more than treatment, but afterward they evolved. Cleanliness was emphasized. Ventilation mattered. Hospitals became places of both care and control, places that separated sickness from the healthy. A new role for the institution of healing had begun. Scientific curiosity was stirred. If invisible things could kill so swiftly, what else lay unseen? The plague didn't just provoke fear. It provoked questions. What caused illness? How did it spread? Could it be predicted? These questions would ripple into later centuries, inspiring early microbiology, chemistry, and epidemiology. Ignorance had been exposed. Curiosity filled the silence. Literature began to record the ordinary. Writers like Chaucer and Boccaccio captured not just kings and knights, but bakers, millers, nuns, and travelers. After the plague, there was a hunger to tell human stories, with flaws, humor, fear, and love. Fiction expanded, diaries appeared. Memory became more personal. The common voice gained value. Governments began keeping better records, tax rolls, death registries, travel permits. The plague forced monarchs and city-states to count, to know how many lived, how many died, who owed what, who had vanished. Administration grew, bureaucracy deepened. In watching death, rulers had learned to watch life. Cities became smarter. Medieval cities had grown haphazardly. After the plague, some were redesigned with wider roads, larger markets, and more organized housing. Sewer systems improved. Cemeteries were placed outside city walls. The air was given more space to breathe. The layout of tomorrow, shaped by yesterday's grief. Education became more accessible. With fewer teachers and more demand, some universities opened doors to a broader audience. More people learned to read. Books spread, slowly at first, then rapidly with the printing press in the 15th century. Thought began to travel faster. Knowledge, once hoarded, began to flow. Death became a part of art, from the macabre woodcuts of Tautantans, the dance of death, to the haunting images of skeletal figures in tapestries and stained glass. Artists captured mortality with both dread and reverence. Death was no longer hidden behind icons. It stood on the canvas, not to scare, but to remind. Faith splintered and strengthened. Some people turned from the church, disappointed by its helplessness. Others turned inward, seeking their own paths. Some grew more devout than ever, driven by gratitude for survival. New sects formed. The seeds of the Reformation, still distant, were quietly planted. Faith did not fade. It multiplied. A more modern world was set in motion. The Black Death did not invent science, individualism, capitalism, or democracy, but it shook the foundations upon which the old world stood. It weakened feudal bonds. It empowered workers. It elevated doubt. It stirred reason. It carved space for new ideas and made the world listen. So even now, centuries later, when we study medicine, when we track illness, when we speak of quarantine or honor frontline workers, we echo a past we rarely name. A shadow that taught us to light candles. A silence that taught us to speak. The plague ended, but its lessons never did. A global grief, the Black Death beyond Europe. When we say the Black Death, we often picture cobbled streets in London, bells in Florence, cloaked doctors in Paris. But this story is older, lighter. Long before it reached Europe, it had swept across kingdoms, deserts, and dynasties. Tonight, we turn our gaze outward to the world beyond the western shore. The plague likely began in Asia. Most scholars believe the pandemic began in Central Asia, near the region where modern-day Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and China meet. A sudden surge in deaths among local populations occurred as early as the 1330s. Tombstone inscriptions record families wiped out long before the plague reached European ports. Even the first chapter was quiet and written in stone. Trade carried it west. The Silk Road, a vast web of trade connecting east to west, was the perfect highway for disease. Merchants, soldiers, animals, grain sacks, and flea-ridden textiles all moved across deserts and cities. The plague likely followed these threads, touching town after town like falling dominoes. Commerce had never moved so fast, and neither had death. China suffered massive losses. Historical records from the Yuan dynasty describe widespread famine, rebellion, and plague. Some estimates suggest that as many as 25 million people may have died in China alone during the 14th century, though exact numbers are uncertain. Entire regions were depopulated, but the stories are scattered, lost to time, language, and buried scroll. The Mongol Empire unknowingly spread it. The Mongols had connected much of Asia and Eastern Europe through conquest and trade. This unity allowed both culture and commerce to flourish, but it also meant that disease could pass easily through garrisons, caravans, and supply routes. The empire's very strength became a vulnerability. Even the most powerful cannot shield against the unseen. The Middle East was deeply affected. The plague reached the Islamic world through trade and pilgrimage routes. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Mecca all reported devastation. Some towns, as much as 2/3 of the population perished. Chroniclers wrote of sudden deaths, blackened limbs, and skies that felt too quiet. Mosques grew still, markets hushed, faith and fear sat side by side. Islamic scholars documented it in detail. Unlike Europe, where superstition dominated much of the early response, many Islamic physicians and writers approached the plague with empirical detail. Scholars like Ibn al-Khatib in Granada and Ibn al-Wardi in Aleppo recorded symptoms, patterns, and even early ideas of contagion. They did not stop the plague, but they remembered it well. North Africa did not escape. As the plague spread through the Middle East, it moved into Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. Alexandria and Cairo were particularly hard hit. Trade through the Mediterranean carried disease along the coast. Deserts offered no defense. The Sahara held its silence, but could not hold back the wind. India felt the ripple, but the record is faint. There are signs of depopulation, trade collapse, and regional disruption in parts of India, but firm evidence of plague's reach is scattered. In some areas, it may have taken different forms or blended with local diseases. What we know is this: the threads of global trade touched every shore, and where trade went, plague often followed. Ships brought it to the Crimea, and then to Europe. As Mongol forces laid siege to the city of Kaffa in 1346, the plague reached the Black Sea. It is here that the disease made its final leap west, through Italian merchant ships across the Mediterranean. From Asia to Europe in less than a year, not carried by intention, only by routine. Reactions varied from place to place. While Europeans often blamed sin, Jews, or divine wrath, the Islamic world saw the plague as a test of faith or as part of divine will. In some cultures, care for the sick remained strong. In others, isolation ruled. Some sought science, others turned inward. But in all places, the result was silence, different prayers, same question. Burial rituals broke down globally. In every region, sacred rites gave way to necessity. Bodies were buried in haste. Traditional prayers were shortened or skipped. Family members were buried together. Grave markers were often omitted. Death became a task, not a ritual. But the grieving never stopped. No culture was untouched, from the steppes of Mongolia to the harbors of Tunis, from the walls of Constantinople to the alleyways of Marseille. The Black Death was not a European tragedy, a shadow cast across the globe. So as we reflect on history, we remember not just the loud stories, not just kings and cities, but the quiet shared experience of suffering, of endurance, of a world bound together by invisible threads. Memory and meaning what the Black Death left behind the streets have long since been swept. The bells no longer toll for plague. The ships no longer carry hidden death. And yet the Black Death remains, not in bodies or bacteria, but in memory, in systems, in questions, in the way we live, in the way we remember. This is where the story settles softly. The plague lives on in language. Words we still use, like quarantine, contagion, epidemic, grew from this time. So did phrases like a bring out your dead and a plague doctor. Even black humor finds roots in the darkness of this age. What we could not say with tears, we sometimes learn to say with words. It shaped how we view death. Before the plague, death was a distant event, marked with ritual, prayer, and grace. After it became something more sudden, more present, more real. Death no longer waited politely. It came to dinner and knocked on every door. And so cultures developed new ways to talk about endings, not to fear them, but to understand them. It taught us to adapt, From medicine to government, from labor to learning. The systems that cracked during the plague were often rebuilt stronger. The world had no choice. And so, like a tree growing around a scar, society bent and reshaped itself. The wound became part of the form. It left behind caution. Centuries passed, but the fear remained. When new outbreaks came in the 1600s, the 1800s, even the 20th century, people remembered. The rituals returned. Quarantines, travel bans, distant funerals. The Black Death had become a blueprint for how to respond to disaster. Memory became prevention. It planted seeds of change, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of science, the shift from feudalism. None were caused solely by the Black Death, but all were shaped by its tremor. The minds that rebuilt the world after plague were different minds, sharpened by loss, softened by survival. The future wore the fingerprints of the past. It appears in stories and dreams. In novels and folklore and paintings and poems, the plague lingers. From the Decameron to the Mask of the Red Death, from medieval murals to modern films, the shadow reappears, not to horrify, but to remind that we are fragile, that we endure, that we remember. It showed us what matters most. When everything else fell away, wealth, pride, comfort, people turned to one another. A hand held at a bedside, a loaf left at a doorstep, a prayer whispered in the dark. Even today, in times of crisis, it is not walls or crowns that save us, but connection, even if it must come from a distance. It connected us across time. When modern pandemics strike, we echo the same behaviors, the same fears, the same kindness, the same grief. The names change, the places shift, but the response is always deeply human. The Black Death is not just history, it is a mirror. It made us ask better questions. What causes disease? What protects life? How should we care for each other? How can we rebuild better? These questions emerged not in universities, but in villages and kitchens and graveyards. They did not always have answers, but they were asked. And asking sometimes is enough. A world that questions is a world that grows. It reminded us that we are part of nature. The plague was not a war, not a crime, not an invention. It was nature, indifferent, invisible, and powerful. And in its path we remembered, we are not above the world, we are within it, small creatures in a large story. It ended, but left a rhythm of caution, of resilience, of silence after sorrow. Even today, when illness sweeps through our lives, that rhythm returns, not as panic, but as memory. We light candles, we lower our voices, we remember those we've lost, and we carry on with quieter footsteps, with deeper breath. The story is still being told, not in stone, not in plague pits, but in classrooms, documentaries, bedtime stories, whispered lessons. We tell this story not to reopen wounds, but to carry the wisdom forward, so that when shadows fall again, we do not stand alone. Because someone long ago walked this road before. So now, as your breath slows, as your thoughts drift, know this: you are part of a long line of survivors, of witnesses, of thinkers, of dreamers. The past rests gently beside you, and so does the strength that came from it. Sleep well. You are safe, you are remembered, and you are never alone.